Eli5 Why rock and roll music in the 90s was called alternative? What was it alternative to? What defined it as a separate genre? Not all rock music in the 90s was considered alternative, and not all alternative music is from the 90s. Alternative began in the 80s and was the label applied to smaller bands that were considered more mature and thoughtful than the arena rock that dominated the airwaves during that era. The alternative style then grew in popularity over time, eventually breaking the mainstream through the success of bands like Nirvana and Ram, at which point what was once the alternative became the mainstream. The real answer, like everything else, is marketing. It was a backlash to pop. Even though some of it was pop, you could listen to it while still feeling individually cool. Some of the biggest acts ever were once alternative. Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Green Day have all hit the charts as alternative. Now they have cemented themselves as mainstream. Alternative had no music meaning, it just meant it wasn't what the 14-18-year-old popular kids were listening to. Plenty of US-based answers. I first heard The Cure, The Smiths and Joy Division on John Peel's evening radio show on BBC Radio 1. They all subsequently appeared on the very commercial Top of the Pops at 7:30 in the evening. I think the main difference from non-alt groups was that they were not aiming to fit in with the commercial pop bands. Their success was not due to trying for a conventionally successful sound. It was actually called alternative rock, and it usually had a lot more grunge sound to it. This was a time when grunge music really came into popularity and took off. Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden and tons more kept making rock and roll music, but they didn't sound anything like 70s rock and roll or 80s hair metal bands. So just calling it alternative stuck, since it was the alternative to what had already come. The style of 90s rock actually began in the 80s but was not very popular in the culture at large during that decade, which is why it was called alternative. In the 90s that style finally went mainstream, with artists like Nirvana topping the charts, and the term of alternative stuck even though it had become somewhat of a misnomer by that point. It was an alternative to this, yes, especially an alternative to this. Then this happened on my TV one Thanksgiving, and my uncle pronounced the band name like the host in the video from then on. It was the alternative to a lot of pre-internet terrible music, pop, boy bands, commercialized hip-hop. Us K people alive at the time did not have YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music or the TikToks, which meant we were dependent on FM radio stations to give us music that was alternative to pop. Total non-expert here, but by the 90s, we had original rock, Chick Berry, Beatles, etc., hippie rock, Zeppelin, Cream, Stones, Grateful Dead, 80s rock, Journey, AC/DC, Springsteen, and we were all getting gray hair, and the kids needed to be kids, so, an alternative to our shit. Here I am face-bombing myself. I was wondering if you had the decade wrong. Surely rock and roll was not alternative in the 90s. That was the 50s. I am an idiot. Thank God for people understanding stuff and Eli5 it. So I don't have to go through life as a complete fool. The stuff called alternative is very much not rock and roll. Rock and roll is the genre played by guys like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Fats Domino. Music by the Smashing Pumpkins or Rim is very different from 1950s rock and roll. We called it grunge. It came into being as anti-hair band, essentially killing it, thank you. Then when bullshit pop started getting hot, some dickhead radio DJ called it alternative. And here we are 30 years later. There's a bunch of ways to describe the differences, but one of the keys was the tuning to get the crappy garage band sound. They would tune way down depending on the band, of course, and the area the bands came from. David Bowie was a pioneer in bringing new music to the mainstream. He knew what the internet would do before it even knew what it could do. On his dying day he released his last album, Fucking Beautiful Human Being. It was just a marketing tactic used to promote new bands. There was a Seattle sound as well, used to describe bands that really weren't similar at all but from a similar area geographically. It was an alternative to Van Halen, Guns N' Roses, AC/DC, Aerosmith, Pink Floyd, Bruce Springsteen, Def Leppard, etc. What defined it was sounding different than arena rock. If the lyrics sound as hopeless as a depressed person, if the guitar sounds like an animal's legs trying to escape a tar pit, you might be listening to 1990s alternative. It was a marketing term for college radio. It was what the young people wanted, to be separate from the previous generation that liked Loverboy and Poison.